It's a calm evening. You're at home, maybe scrolling on your phone or cooking dinner. Without warning, boom, lights flicker out. Your phone dies, and every appliance falls silent. You step outside and see the darkness blanketing the neighborhood, the city, maybe the entire region. Cars have stalled out on the road. The usual glow of distant city lights on the horizon is gone. An uneasy chill runs down your spine as you realize that maybe this isn't a normal blackout. In an instant, modern life as we know it has changed. What just happened? Tonight, we're going to explore that exact nightmare scenario, a massive electromagnetic pulse, or EMP event, and what it means for us all. I'm your host, Jesse with the Survival Summit. I have a co-owner now. He's not on this stream, and this is actually not a stream. This is a podcast. We tried to do the live stream tonight. It is Thursday, May 1st, 2025, but our software was having all kinds of issues, so this is actually pre-recorded, and it is not live. Scooter Brown from the Scooter Brown Band has joined Survival Summit as a co-owner along with myself, and hopefully he will be on one of these podcasts or live streams at some point very soon. So for the next hour or so, we're going to be diving deep into the EMPocalypse, what EMPs are, how a high-altitude nuclear blast could fry our grid, how a solar superstorm could do the same, and what history teaches us from incidents like Starfish Prime, the Carrington event, and the 1989 Quebec blackout. We'll break down the differences between a nuclear EMP attack and a solar flare's geomagnetic onslaught. And I'll reveal some shocking facts like government tests on EMP vehicle vulnerability and the flaws with those tests, and what our leaders have or have not done about this threat. Most importantly, we'll talk preparedness, how you can plan for such a scenario, from safeguarding electronics to the communication PACE plan. PACE plan stands for primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. And we wrote a book on PACE planning. You could find it on thesurvivalsummit.com or on Amazon. And I believe we have it also on the TikTok shop. So let's get comfortable. Maybe even grab a notepad. This isn't meant to scare you senseless. It's meant to empower you with knowledge. The goal is by the end of this stream or podcast, you'll not only grasp the gravity of an EMP event, but you'll also feel more confident that there are steps you can take to survive and even thrive if the worst should ever happen. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is an EMP? What is an electromagnetic pulse? It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie or a high-tech weapon from a video game, but it's very real. An EMP is essentially a burst of electromagnetic energy that can occur naturally or be man-made. This surge of energy is so powerful it can disrupt, degrade, and damage the electronic systems and critical infrastructure over a wide area. In simpler terms, an EMP is like an invisible shockwave of energy that can fry electronic circuits and knock out power grids in the blink of an eye. There are two main sources of EMPs we worry about. The nuclear high-altitude EMP, also known as a HEMP, basically a nuclear explosion detonated high in the atmosphere, and a solar-induced EMP from severe space weather, solar flares, coronal mass injections. We're going to dig into both types in detail. What they have in common is the effect. If strong enough, an EMP, whether from a warhead or the sun, could cripple our modern technological society in an instant. To understand how, let's break it down a little bit further. When an EMP strikes, it generally produces three-phased. Often they call them the E1 pulse, the E2 pulse, and the E3 pulse. E1 is a super intense fast pulse. Imagine a massive surge of energy that zaps through in microseconds. The kind of pulse that can fry microchips and digital circuitry, which is essentially inside the brains of all of our electronic gadgets. E2, it's a medium-sized pulse. Medium speed pulse. Somewhat like the effect of many lightning strikes happening at once. It's usually a lot less damaging than E1 and is often absorbed by the same protections we use against lightning. E3. E3 is a very slow pulse lasting seconds to minutes, which behaves more like a geomagnetic disturbance. It induces current in long electrical lines, punching power transformers and grid infrastructure right in the face. A nuclear EMP will generate all three, E1, E2, and E3. The difference, a solar storm's EMP is mainly troublesome with the E3 component. Slower, but affecting large-scale systems like the power grid over entire continents. In practical terms, a sufficiently strong enough EMP could knock out high-voltage transformers that carry electricity across regions, take down communications networks, and really it could leave almost any unprotected electronic device pretty useless. Think about what runs on electronics. Not just your phone and computer, but everything. Most cars, hospitals, banks, water treatment plants, pipelines, airlines, the logistical systems that deliver food to the grocery stores, all of it. We're talking about a potential societal reset to the pre-electric age in the matter of seconds. It's kind of a big deal. Get rid of my notes as we go. Now, an EMP can be caused by different events, and we mentioned both of them. The first one is the high altitude, which is basically an attack where a nuclear bomb is detonated high above the ground, generally in the upper atmosphere between 60 and 250 miles in altitude. It doesn't create the classic mushroom cloud or the ground shock wave that we normally associate with nuclear blast, and there's no nuclear fallout. Instead, it unleashes a massive pulse of electromagnetic energy. In fact, the weapon's blast isn't what threatens us at all. It's the invisible EMP racing down through the atmosphere. A singular nuclear explosion in space, if optimized for EMP, could blanket an entire continent with that pulse of energy in milliseconds. Here's how it works. A nuclear detonation high in the atmosphere releases an intense burst of gamma rays. Those gamma rays slam into the air molecules and strip away the electrons. A process called the Compton effect. And no, that's not a California thing. Those electrons, now energized, spiral into the Earth's magnetic field and radiate electromagnetic waves. That results in an electromagnetic pulse spreading out far from the blast point. At high altitudes, there's no air blast or thermal radiation reaching the ground, only the EMP itself. The higher the bomb goes off, to a point, the broader the horizon of the EMP effect. Detonate a large nuclear weapon 250 miles above the central U.S., and the EMP could conceivably cover most of the continental United States. There would be no sound, no flash on the ground. You wouldn't even know what happened, except everything electronic would just stop working. This might sound like doomsday propaganda, and right now, I faintly hear the screams of a few dozen people on the internet claiming there's no such thing, there's no evidence of an EMP weapon. Really, it's just whining, because it's actually been observed in real life. Back in 1962, the days of atmospheric nuclear testing, which we don't do anymore, that's why they now do nuclear testing underground. The United States conducted a test called Starfish Prime. This was only a 1.4 megaton nuclear bomb detonated about 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean. The effects stunned everyone. In Hawaii, nearly 900 miles away from the explosion, the EMP was strong enough that it knocked out hundreds of streetlights and set off numerous burglar alarms. Think about that. A nuke goes off in space far to the southwest, and in Hawaii, streetlights blink in and out, alarm systems go off, blaring in the night. It also destroyed a recently installed microwave communications link in Hawaii. In space, several satellites were damaged by the radiation and the pulse effects. This singular test proved that an EMP was not just theoretical, it was a real phenomenon with a very wide reach. Scientists were shocked. The blast EMPs were much larger than expected, essentially teaching us the hard way that even a small to medium-sized nuke could have continent-spanning effects via EMP. Now imagine if it weren't a test, but an actual attack aimed at the U.S. by an adversary. The blast wouldn't directly kill anyone, no explosion or radiation on the ground at all, but the EMP could take down the grid and electronics across most of the country in an instant. Planes could lose instrumentation, and no, they would not just fall out of the sky. Some of them could. That's really just movie magic nonsense. The power grid, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The power grid would likely go down as the transformers and substations got completely overloaded. Unprotected computers and control systems in hospitals, water utilities, factories, all fried. Civilization, at least temporarily in that region, gets unplugged. This is the nightmare that keeps the military and emergency planners up at night. a rogue nation, or even a sophisticated terrorist group launching a nuclear warhead on a missile and detonating it high above the target country to produce an EMP. The immediate effect: widespread infrastructure collapse without a single direct casualty, at least not at the moment of the blast. But the indirect effects, which we're going to talk about tonight, could be beyond catastrophic. To put numbers to it, a nuclear EMP attack can induce electrical field strengths on the order of tens of thousands of volts per meter. For comparison, your household electronics may run on 5, 12, 120 volts. Imagine thousands of volts surging instantaneously through every power line and every device. Wires acting as antennas would pick up the pulse, circuits would get overloaded and burn out in microseconds. The first component of the nuclear EMP, the E1, is the real electronics killer. It's so fast and powerful that most surge protectors and shielding cannot react in time. The slower E3 can knock out big parts of the grid and big components by inducing currents in the long transmission lines. We have an ominous hint of what a nuclear EMP could do from historic events and tests, which we'll dive into in a minute. But before that, it's important to know nuclear weapons are not the only threat. Mother Nature has her own version of an EMP, courtesy of our sun. And sometimes it can be just as devastating as a nuke in space. So now let's talk about solar storms, solar flares, and geomagnetic events. The sun can launch solar flares and coronal mass injections, also known as CMEs, if directed at Earth, cause a type of natural EMP. They aren't exactly the same as the nuclear EMP. There's no high-frequency E1 pulse to fry the small electronics instantly, but the effect of the infrastructure can remarkably be similar because the E3 pulse that is inducing through all the long transmission lines. In a solar EMP scenario, a huge explosion on the sun's surface, a flare, often coupled with a CME, hurls a cloud of charged plasma towards the Earth. When the wave of solar plasma slams into the Earth's magnetic field, it's like a cosmic shove to our planet's protective shield. The Earth's magnetic field oscillates and fluctuates under the impact. We call that a geomagnetic disturbance. In essence, the interaction with the solar blast and Earth's magnetosphere generates long-duration electromagnetic currents here on Earth's surface. What does that do? Well, it induces electrical currents in any long conductors, mainly power lines, pipelines. The longer line, think cross-country transmission lines, the more voltage gets induced. During a solar storm, massive currents can suddenly surge through the entire grid. Transformers, those giant yard-side hunks of steel that convert electricity to either higher or lower voltages, they can overheat and burn out. Circuit breakers trip. The grid, mainly built for ordinary weather and normal electrical loads, gets stretched beyond the limits. The result: widespread blackouts, even transformer explosions. Solar-induced EMPs build more slowly, over tens of seconds to minutes, compared to the nuclear EMP's microblast, or microsecond blast, but they can last longer and affect extremely large areas, potentially the entire sunlit side of Earth, in fact. One key difference: a solar storm will not typically ruin your cell phone or laptop directly at the circuitry level, the way a nuclear EMP E1 pulse would, because the energy is low frequency. It's mainly dangerous to systems with long conductive pathways. Again, power grids, long communication cables, etc. However, if the grid goes down hard, and all those gadgets might as well be bricks, because the infrastructure they depend on and the electrocommunications networks could be out for weeks or months, and if it's widespread enough, even longer. And keep in mind, with the E3 pulse, anything you have plugged in to the outlets in your home, those will also be affected by that long pulse. History gives us stark examples. The most famous EMP event was the Carrington event of 1859. Back then, we barely even had electrical technology. Basically, we had the telegraph system. Yet that solar superstorm caused telegraph lines to spark and set some telegraph offices on fire. There was auroras, the northern and southern lights they were calling them. They were seen as far as the Caribbean, or Caribbean, whatever you guys want to say. If a storm of that magnitude hit us today, with the trillions of dollars in integrated electronics, the consequences would be beyond devastating. Another notable incident was March 1989, when a strong geomagnetic storm hit Earth and knocked out the Hydro-Quebec power grid in Canada. causing a province-wide blackout that lasted 9 hours. Over 6 million customers lost power in Quebec in that event. Now, that's a relatively moderate event compared to the Carrington event, to say the least. Now, consider this: July 2012. We had a near miss by a solar superstorm that scientists say was just as powerful as the Carrington event. A massive CME tore through Earth's orbit, and the Earth had moved out of that spot just 1 week prior. In other words, if it had erupted a week earlier, we would have taken a direct hit, and it would have been like the Carrington event, except all of our electronic systems are no, we're not just running telegraph machines, we're running pretty much everything off of electricity. Dr. Daniel Baker, who's a leading space weather scientist, said at the time, if it had hit, we'd still be picking up the pieces. It was the most potent solar storm in at least the last 150 years. How many of us have even heard about this near disaster? Not many. It barely even made the news because it missed. But if the Earth was incredibly fortunate that it did miss. When we talk about EMP solar threats, they're not talking hypotheticals. These are not just things people think could possibly happen. And it's not blind luck. It is blind luck, actually, that we were missed in 2012, because if we had a repeat of 1859, the Carrington event, it could have taken down the entire grid in the United States and other countries as well. And I'm not sure if we would have ever recovered from that. So a major solar event, also called a solar superstorm, could be a true global catastrophe. Modern analysis suggests that if a Carrington-class storm hit today, it could cause widespread power blackouts, disabling everything that plugs into a wall socket. The damage could take years to repair. Some estimates cost $1 to $2 trillion just the first year, and that's 20 plus times the cost of Hurricane Katrina. Society would be in massive trouble. So to summarize those basics, an EMP, whether from a nuclear weapon or from the sun, is really bad news for electronics and the grid. A nuclear EMP hits fast, hits hard, and can fry electronics on all scales. But it's also determined by the line of sight from detonation, which, if it's a high enough altitude, could be a real problem. A solar EMP, the geomagnetic storm, develops over minutes to hours, primarily wrecking big infrastructure, but on a planetary scale. The entire day side of Earth, and possibly more. One is intentional, the other is natural, but both could knock us back to 19th century technology in minutes or less. Next, we're going to get into some historical events that I already talked about a couple times. We're going to get into Starfish Prime. So history has left us some breadcrumbs. They've left us some truth about EMPs and glimpses of what could happen. So we'll walk through these briefly. Starfish Prime 1962, the one I mentioned earlier. On July 9th, 1962, the U.S. detonated a 1.45 megaton nuclear bomb in space, 250 miles into the atmosphere, above the Pacific. This test was meant to understand the nuclear effects in space. It was the Cold War, and we were prepping for worst-case scenarios. The result was a light show in the air and an EMP shock that no one fully anticipated. In Hawaii, the night sky turned eerie colors, a rainbow bomb effect, and then parts of the electrical system started to fail. Hundreds of streetlights blew out in Honolulu, burglar alarms went off, and a telecommunications microwave link was completely destroyed. It was as if the universe said, "Surprise, I can reach out and touch you from space." Starfish Prime taught the military and scientists just how far-reaching a high-altitude nuclear EMP could be. It also damaged at least 6 satellites in orbit because the blast pumped high-energy electrons into Earth's magnetosphere, forming an artificial radiation belt. Some of these satellites failed over subsequent months due to radiation damage. This event is why today, any talk of nuclear EMP isn't dismissed as fantasy. We actually saw it happen. I wasn't around in 1962, but plenty of people were, and it's been reported on, and there's plenty of documentation to read about this. The US and the Soviet Union actually conducted several high-altitude tests in 1962, and the Soviets observed similar EMP effects in Central Asia. One test reportedly knocked out diesel generators hundreds of miles away. After that, above-ground nuclear tests were banned, partly because of nuclear fallout concerns, but also because of the unpredictable effects on civilian infrastructure from high-altitude EMPs. Carrington event of 1859. Long before we had any idea what EMPs were, the sun gave Earth to a monstrous sucker punch. British astronomer Richard Carrington observed a massive solar flare on September 1st, 1859. Within 17 hours, a wave of charged solar particles hit Earth's magnetic field. The ensuing magnetic storm is still the worst on record. Auroras lit up skies around the world. People in tropical Cuba and Hawaii saw auroras like blood red skies, and they were thinking the world might be on fire. Telegraph networks, the Victorian era internet, went haywire. Telegraph operators were shocked. They were shocked by the sparks leaping from their telegraph equipment. Papers caught fire in the telegraph offices. Even when they disconnected the batteries, telegraph systems still reportedly continued to send signals, powered just by the induced currents from the geomagnetic storm. It was that intense. In the event of a magnitude strike like that today, virtually every high-voltage transformer in the exposed half of the world could be overloaded. Satellites would likely be heavily damaged by radiation. The internet, which relies on long undersea cables with repeaters, which are powerful amplifiers, might sustain damage to those repeaters. It could be, as one scientist put it, the ultimate planetary disaster short of an asteroid impact, which sounds pretty crazy when you think about it like that. We'd be sent to analog living for who knows how long. The Quebec blackout in 1989. Clearly not as huge as the Carrington event of 1859, but extremely instructive. On March 13th, 1989, a series of CMEs from a strong solar storm hit Earth. The geomagnetic storm induced currents in the Quebec power grid, and in the pre-dawn hours, the entire Hydro-Quebec electrical grid crashed. Voltage fluctuations caused protective systems to trip, and within seconds, Quebec was electronically isolated and dark. The blackout lasted about 9 hours. During that same storm, the U.S. grid had experienced some issues, and even satellites in orbit reported some anomalies. One geostationary satellite had onboard equipment disruptions. Quebec learned from that. Since then, they've worked on mitigation like series capacitors to block those geomagnetic currents, but it was a wake-up call. A moderate solar storm caused the domino effect blackout of an entire province. Thankfully, it was resolved in hours and equipment wasn't permanently destroyed, but it showed the vulnerability. So the Halloween storm of 2003, late October 2003, a set of solar storms, often called the Halloween storms, caused geomagnetic disturbances that tripped power grids in Sweden and auroras in Texas. Transformers in South Africa were even damaged. It wasn't as big as 1989, but it reminded us that even smaller storms can have a global reach in our interconnected grid. Again, the near miss of 2012, which we talked about already. In July 2012, a massive solar flare just missed Earth by about a week. A NASA study later detailed that if we were hit, we could have suffered widespread blackout and damages we might still be recovering from years later. Our society's infrastructure fragility was basically spared by a cosmic roll of the dice. That could have been extremely bad had we been hit by that. The take home from these events, EMP incidents have happened and will happen again, whether they're man-made or whether they're coming from the sun. Be it from human action or Mother Nature, we've seen the impacts on a small scale, and each time the lesson is the same. Our technological systems are our Achilles heel. A burst of energy in the sky can knock out systems we always thought were dependable. So, with history as our guide, let's fast forward to today. What would an EMP do to modern infrastructure, say if it happened tonight or tomorrow? And how prepared or unprepared are we? Time to assess the risks to our power grid, communications, transportation, and more, with the modern context in mind. So, infrastructure. Just imagine in one instant the entire power grid from coast to coast goes down. Not just a local outage, but a simultaneous failure of generation plants and transmission lines across vast areas. No electricity for millions and millions of people. What happens? Within minutes, most places are in the dark. Hospitals switch to backup generators, those that do have them. Emergency dispatch centers might run on backup power for a while, but water treatment plants, down. Communications network, largely down. Transportation systems, chaos. Let's break down major infrastructure categories and how an EMP, or whether it's nuclear or solar, could impact them. The power grid's the big one. The grid is essentially the central nervous system of modern civilization. It powers everything else. An EMP, the E3 component or geomagnetic storm, introduces a surge in the long transmission lines that form the backbone of the grid. Large transformers, which are critical for stepping up and stepping down voltage, can overheat and burn out if they're subjected to the geomagnetic induced currents and they're strong enough. These transformers are not easy to replace. And guess what? They don't make them in the United States. They're made in other countries. As far as I know, they don't make any of them in the United States. And each one can take months or even years to manufacture and get ready to ship over here. And they weigh hundreds of tons. And only a limited number of spares even exist. If in a nuclear EMP attack scenario, the fast E1 pulse could blow out control systems and sensors throughout the grid in an instant. Protective relays, SCADA systems, which monitor and control grid components, and power plant electronics could all be fried. The grid could essentially self-protect by shutting down to prevent further damage leading to a blackout. But many components might be permanently damaged in the process. Analysts believe that a powerful enough EMP, like the 2012 class solar storm or a high-yield super EMP weapon, could cause widespread power blackouts, disabling everything that plugs into a wall socket. Picture all the lights out, and not just for a night. We're talking about the grid being down for weeks, months, or in the absolute worst-case scenario, even longer in some regions. The National Academy of Sciences estimated a severe solar EMP could leave over 100 million people without power for years in the worst-case scenario, due to the difficulty of replacing all the critical and crippled equipment. Without electricity, practically every other critical infrastructure either fails or struggles. Communications, finance, healthcare, transportation, water, you name it. The internet is a vast web of servers, undersea cables, landlines, cell towers, and satellites. Wait, I already hear someone saying, satellites aren't real. Someone on the internet just said that. Sorry, I gotta mess with people occasionally. A strong EMP would cause immediate high-frequency disruptions that could knock out cell tower electronics and data center equipment if they aren't shielded. More critically, without power, the routers and switches that route internet traffic will stop. Many telecom facilities have backup generators or batteries, but they only last for so long. Hours to a couple of days is typical. A solar EMP could induce currents that physically damage long-distance fiber lines that have electrical components, which are repeaters and amplifiers, and could blow fuses and telephone exchanges. Satellites could be disrupted by radiation from a nuclear EMP or the charged particles of a solar storm. GPS satellites, for example, might fail or even give bad data, compounding navigation issues. In short, shortly after an EMP, you can expect no cell service, no internet, no functioning television, or even radio broadcast, except maybe some handy analog radio operators. The only communications that might still work are those that are EMP hardened, which very few civilian systems are, or devices that were effectively shielded, something like in a metal safe or a microwave, or preferably an EMP bag or a Faraday bag, which you can get on thesurvivalsummit.com. Be careful where you get them. Make sure they have good testing. Make sure you know how many decibels of attenuation the Faraday bags are good for. But you really should put all of your backup electronics into a Faraday or an EMP bag to protect them from either, well, if they're not plugged into the grid, again, the solar storm is not going to create the E1 pulse, so you don't have to worry about your electronics not plugged into the grid being destroyed for a massive solar flare. But if it's a nuclear high-altitude EMP, you 1,000,000% have to be worried about it. So modern cities, when it comes to water and sewage systems, they are utterly dependent on electrically powered pumps for not just water supply, but sewage treatment as well. No power, no pumps. Most urban residents get water from a faucet due to electric pumps pushing it through a maze of pipes and up into the water towers. Those water towers can supply pressure for a short time. But within a day or two, they'll either go empty or the pressure will drop and the taps will run dry. Likewise, sewer treatment plants without power will cease processing waste. You might even get sewage backup if pumping stations fail. As one NASA report on solar storms noted rather bluntly, quote, most people wouldn't even be able to flush their toilet, unquote, after, after the widespread grid failure. Now, remember, most people. A lot of people have septic systems, so it's not going to be everyone. But mostly in the big cities and even in some of the suburbs where you're on town and city water, you could have a lot of issues. And lack of water becomes a life-threatening problem within days. You need about 2 liters of water a day, not counting sanitation. Typically, you need at least a gallon a day per person for drinking and sanitation. And fires can't be fought effectively if the hydrants go dry. It's essentially a cascading crisis. Transportation. Think of all the ways transportation lies on power and electronics. Fuel. Gas pumps need electricity. Without power, you can't refill your car. Backup generators at gas stations are pretty rare. I'm not sure I've seen one. I'm sure some gas stations have them, but I don't know exactly how many. Vehicles. Modern cars and trucks themselves might survive an EMP in some cases, but it will likely shut off if a nuclear EMP's E1 hits their electronics. An EMP Commission test in 2004 found that many cars turned off but could be restarted, and only a small percentage suffered permanent damage. However, we're going to get into the major flaws from that study in a little bit, and there were a lot of them. Also, if your car's fine, traffic control systems won't be. Traffic lights, dark. Highway electronic signs off. Smart vehicle management systems down. The result could be immediate accidents and serious gridlock. We might see chaotic congestion with vehicles stranded in the middle of roads. For air travel, airplanes are designed with some shielding and redundancy. And a plane in flight might actually be okay flying through an EMP. It's a matter of debate and scenario, of course. But navigation systems and radar would definitely be disrupted. Planes might lose instrumentation, and pilots would have to rely on backup altimeters and line of sight flying. Air traffic control centers would lose radar systems and communications. Most planes would be grounded pretty quickly or diverted. Worst case, some planes could potentially fall out of the sky if they lost too many systems at once. But that's very speculative. On the ground, trains would halt, locomotives have electronics, and signaling systems would fail. And forget fuel distribution. Pipelines using electric pump stations, refineries, distribution terminals would likely go offline. So even if some vehicles work, fuel supply would soon dry up. Within a week, almost no cars or trucks would be running simply because they ran out of fuel. Or they couldn't be pumped. This impacts food supply. Huge. Grocery stores only have a few days of food, and they rely on daily restocks by the trucking industry. Banking and finance. In our digital age, money is mostly electronic. An EMP taking out power and computers could mean banks close. ATMs don't work. Credit card machines don't work. Even if you have stacks of cash, which most people don't usually carry too much cash these days, commerce will be a mess because of pricing systems, digital registers, everything electronic. If it fails, cash isn't really going to do you much good. And the stock markets, they'll definitely halt. Not that they'd matter to you immediately, but the economic wreckage is part of the overall scenario. After a few days, cash would be much less valuable than tangible goods like food, fuel, batteries, medicine. Bartering and trading would become very normal. Emergency services, first responders, police, fire, EMS, they rely on radios, 911 dispatch centers, and vehicles. Some of their gear is hardened or as backups, but not all. Police cars and ambulances are just vehicles with the same vulnerabilities. Radios might survive if they're simple with short antennas, but dispatch infrastructure likely will be hit. There's no doubt emergency service either way will be overwhelmed instantly from fires, from electrical surges causing shorts, accidents, people in need, but they're going to be operating with hobbled communications at best and potentially very limited mobility. Hospitals, so they have backup generators typically with fuel for a couple days. They'll triage hard, only critical life-saving equipment will be powered, but if resupply doesn't come and generators eventually sputter out, hospitals are going to revert to medieval conditions. Doctors working by flashlight, and especially medications like insulin that require refrigeration, they're going to start spoiling within a matter of hours without power, and that's going to put a lot of lives at risk. Consumer electronics and appliances. This one's more about personal convenience But yes, your phone, laptop, TV, appliances, hearing aids, pacemakers could be damaged by the initial EMP. But if they aren't, they're essentially still going to be paperweights without the power grid. Some smaller devices not plugged in to long antennas or cords might come through even an E1 pulse from a high altitude EMP without much of a problem. And maybe even your smartphone, if it's not connected to a charger or a wired headset, could survive the pulse. It's so small that maybe it doesn't pick up the larger voltages. But surviving does not mean functional. With no cell towers, no internet, a phone is just a paperweight. Although, if you keep your spare phone in an EMP or a Faraday bag and keep your thousands of survival manuals on a USB thumb drive, that way you can access all of that without having to have hundreds and hundreds of books. We've done videos on this before, and we have a lot of really good videos showing the different types of communication devices and things that we use that we protect with Faraday bags. You can make your own Faraday cages. Some people like to even use multiple layers of tinfoil. You just have to make sure you know how to test them if you're not buying them from a reputable company that does test them already. All right, so battery-powered devices would still turn on if they weren't fried, but they won't connect to anything unless you have local radios. One piece of hopeful news, kind of hopeful news, vehicles and small electronics may be more resilient than we thought. USP EMP Commission in 2004 tested 37 cars and trucks, model years 1986 to 2002, in an EMP simulator. Most of the vehicles, when subjected to simulated EMP pulses, only had some nuisance effects. Blinking dash lights, maybe the engine stopped, and the engines could be restarted. Only one vehicle in the test had to be towed due to EMP-induced damage. And 8 of the 37 showed no issues at all. That sounds reassuring. However, we need to consider some big caveats and flaws in that test. And we're going to discuss those in the next section on government action because it's a huge, huge point. Modern cars post 2002 have far more computers. Many vehicles have dozens of microprocessors, some as many as 100 microprocessors on one board. Sorry, on board, not on one board. I don't know why I said that. Controlling everything from the engine to the door locks. And newer cars also have better built-in electromagnetic interference shielding and robust designs to meet regulatory standards than the older ones did. But more electronics, more potential failure points. Critical industrial systems, oil refineries, chemical plants, manufacturing lines, these are often controlled by computerized systems that could be damaged. A sudden power loss could also lead to dangerous situations like chemical factory losing control of pressure valves. There could be secondary disasters like chemical spills or fires at industrial sites. One thing I don't have listed in my notes, and I'm kind of disappointed in myself that I didn't put it in here, is that a lot of the nuclear power plants, they're not just going to immediately melt down if the entire grid goes down. Some of them, and I'll do a video on this soon because I think it's important. You would have localized major meltdown issues in some cases, but not everywhere and not worldwide. I think that's a very important thing to note. So I want to underscore something. While the immediate damage from EMP could be huge, the long-term societal impact is the real killer. Various official estimates have been made of the consequences of a nationwide grid down scenario, and the numbers are grim. According to congressional testimony and reports, 2008, 2004 congressional EMP reports, in the worst case, 90% of the population could potentially die within a year in the aftermath of a nationwide EMP. You heard that right. 9 out of 10 people. How? Think the collapse of supply chains. No food delivery. No sanitation. No medication. No heating or air conditioning. Likely no law and order. It becomes a cascading failure. It's kind of almost beyond comprehension to think of what could happen. We are deeply dependent on daily functioning infrastructure to keep us alive. Take that away, most people are not self-sufficient. Now, that 90% figure is the worst case scenario, often cited by experts like Dr. William Fortune. I'm probably saying that name wrong. I'll have to remember how to say his name. And the late Dr. Peter Fry, who was also a leader of the EMP Commission. Could it be that bad? Honestly, nobody knows for sure. And hopefully we never find out. But even a much smaller die-off would be a tragedy of an unprecedented scale. So in 2008 congressional hearing, Dr. William Graham, then chairman of the EMP Commission, was asked about the plausibility of a scenario depicted in the novel 1 Second After, where 90% of the U.S. population dies within a year after an EMP attack. And Dr. Graham responded, "We think that is in the correct range." So it's not technically in the actual 2004 or 2008 EMP report itself, but through congressional testimony, which you can find at the Library of Congress. I think I actually linked it on some of the social media today on a couple different videos, but you can find where he says, yes, that is within the correct range, and that's what they believe. So while not technically in the report, it was discussed in congressional testimony by the heads of the EMP Commission, the same ones who wrote the EMP Commission reports. So some guy on YouTube said that we needed to prove it. Just always do your own research. Don't take anyone's word for it. Look it up yourself. I'm not an expert. I'm really not an expert in much at all, as a matter of fact. So please always do your own research. And if I'm wrong about something, I have absolutely no issue telling you I was wrong and correcting it for the record, because I don't want to put out bad information. So this estimate reflects expert opinion based on analysis of potential cascading failures in critical infrastructures, such as the electrical grid, water supply, and food distribution systems following a large-scale EMP event. So knowing all this, you might wonder, what's being done about it? Surely our government and critical industries have taken this threat seriously and have robust mitigation in place, right? This is where we have to have a frank conversation about EMP preparedness at the national level. The policies, the studies, and the critiques. Buckle up, because this part is going to be a little bit of a mix of progress and frustration. So government action or inaction on the EMP threat. What exactly have our leaders and institutions done to prepare for an EMP catastrophe? The answer is a little bit of a roller coaster. There have been commissions, executive orders, some hardening of military assets, and a lot of foot dragging and a lot of debate. Let's chronologically hit the highlights. The EMP Commission 2001 to 2008 revived briefly in 2016 to 2017. In the early 2000s, Congress established a commission to assess the threat to the United States from electromagnetic pulse attack, usually just called the EMP Commission. This commission brought together scientists, defense experts, and others to study what EMP, either nuclear or natural, could do and how to mitigate it. They released reports in 2004 and 2008 detailing the vulnerabilities of the U.S. critical infrastructure. One of the notable things the EMP Commission did was test vehicles and other equipment, as I mentioned before. It's cited endlessly and a lot of the times incorrectly, and it's debated about you'll see it in a lot of prepper blogs and magazines where people are saying most cars would still run. The commission only tested I think it's 37 vehicles, and those vehicles were from 1986 to 2002, meaning even at the time, they were not brand new models. These tests were done at an EMP simulator facility. The commission didn't even publicly list which models and makes were tested. They kept it pretty vague. They would run a vehicle or have it off and subject it to increased EMP field strengths. If the car showed any anomalous behavior, say the engine stopped or electronics malfunctioned, they halted the test at that point for that specific vehicle. If nothing happened, they'd push the simulator to higher intensities up to the simulator's limit, which is around 50 kVm field strength. The results as published, as field levels reached 25 kVm and above, some vehicles experienced stalls or nuance effects, but most could be restarted and only one vehicle had to be towed for repairs. They concluded that the field strengths below 25 kVm, 25,000 volts per meter, vehicles would likely have few issues, and above that, maybe 10% or more might stall, but could be recovered. And a large fraction would have just been annoyance stuff like, blinking indicators and things like that. These findings led some people to say, wow, most vehicles would be fine in an EMP. However, critics pounced on the limitations of those tests, and unfortunately, you still read a ton of blogs on prepper sites that don't even talk about this part, which can be pretty annoying. First, stopping the test when something went wrong meant never pushing the vehicle to the actual point of failure. Except the one truck that died. The reason they stopped, the EMP Commission had actually borrowed these vehicles, mostly from other government fleets, and was financially responsible to return them in working order. They didn't have the budget to fry cars completely, so they intentionally halted before causing irreparable damage in most cases. In other words, these cars were never tested to the true destruction levels, so we don't actually know how many might have failed if they kept going. One insider from the commission staff later basically said the test results in the report were phrased in an overly optimistic way and could be misleading, given how the testing was cut short. Secondly, all vehicles were pre-2003 models. Today's cars have far more electronics, so their vulnerability could be different. Thirdly, the EMP simulator had a certain waveform and limit. Some experts argue a real nuclear EMP could exceed the simulator, especially certain types of super EMP weapons that might produce fields of greater than 50 kVm in some areas. The Commission's own public expectations note about 10% or more of the cars might experience serious effects at higher fields, but a real high-altitude EMP could potentially produce fields significantly above what they were testing at. So some experts say the Commission's test, while the best info we have at the moment, may actually understate the potential damage to vehicles, basically because the testing was limited and somewhat outdated. In fact, a preparedness advocacy site outright called the site fake news, and I don't blame them. I'm not sure I want to say exactly which site that was, but if you guys are into this community and have been for a while, you probably know who they are. They basically said it was not representative of a real world EMP strike, and I would definitely agree with that. They're strong words, but they're not without truth. And as of now, no further public comprehensive vehicle EMP testing has been done by the U.S. government that I am aware of. I don't think anything's been released since 2004 or since they did additional studies in 2008. They warned the electrical grid and power could suffer a nationwide collapse and take months to recover, leading to the collapse of other critical infrastructure, water, food, healthcare, medical, all kinds of stuff. So after 2008, the Commission's mandate ended, and it was actually disbanded. It saw a brief revival around 2016 to 2017 to update findings, and it issued some additional reports in 2017, but by late 2017, it was dissolved again. I still need to speak with a friend of ours who we made a film with, Jonathan Holloman from Grid Down Consulting, and I want to see if he has any new information, and I also need to get him on this live stream at some point, because he is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to this type of information. The bottom line from the Commission, the EMP threat is real and could be existential for the country if it's not addressed. They recommended various hardening measures like surge protectors on the grid, stockpiling spare transformers. They also emphasized that we needed to prepare not just for nuclear EMPs, but for solar superstorms, which inevitably will happen given enough time. So let's talk about presidential executive orders and actions. After the EMP Commission was slowed a major step on March 26, 2019, when President Donald Trump signed an Executive Order 13865, titled Coordinating National Resilience to Electromagnetic Pulses. This was the first high-level whole-of-government directive on EMP in the U.S. It was the first of its kind. It basically told all relevant federal agencies to get their act together, assess the EMP risk to critical infrastructure, and devise protection devices and responses and plans, and start mitigating wherever possible. It recognized both nuclear EMP and extreme solar weather as threats. This executive order was a big deal symbolically. It showed the executive branch taking EMPs seriously. It led to various agencies like Department of Energy, Homeland Security, working on reports and strategies. For example, the Department of Energy was tasked to focus on protecting the electric grid and improving our understanding of EMP effects. The Department of Homeland Security started to include EMP scenarios in planning. The executive order also emphasized improving early warning capabilities for solar storms and enhancing national response plans. Following that, in May of 2020, Trump issued another relevant executive order, this one more indirectly related to an EMP, Executive Order 13920 on securing United States bulk power system was signed on May 1st, 2020. It was mainly aimed at preventing foreign adversaries, like potentially China or Russia, from inserting compromised components into the U.S. electrical grid via the supply chain. You guys may have heard about this when this executive order came out. In other words, it restricted the purchases of electronic equipment from the grid from countries that we deemed could be a risk. While this order was about cybersecurity and sabotage threats to the grid, not directly about EMP or solar storms, it ties in because a more secure grid supply chain and infrastructure could help our resilience overall. It showed a concern for grid security at the highest level. It's worth noting that this bulk power system executive order was later suspended July 2021 by the Biden administration, pending review. So ultimately, its fate is uncertain. Fast forward in the years since under the Biden administration, 2021 to 2025, the focus shifts more towards grid modernization and resilience to climate and weather events generally. It was a bipartisan infrastructure law passed in late 2021, and it poured billions, supposedly, into upgrading the electrical grid, about $65 billion for the grid infrastructure, resiliency, and expansion. For example, 2024, the Department of Energy announced a $2.2 billion investment in 8 major projects across 18 states to strengthen the grid. These projects aim to harden the grid against extreme weather, add transmission capacity, and integrate renewable energy. All good things. This helps overall with resilience because, again, a stronger grid is better against any threat. However, specific measures for EMP protection, like installing EMP filters or Faraday shielding on critical components, or maintaining backup transformers in Faraday storage, were not a centerpiece of these efforts. It appeared the Biden administration did not prioritize EMP-specific initiatives to the extent that some advocates wanted. They were more focused on things like cybersecurity, physical security from sabotage, and decarbonization. To be fair, there have been some continued quiet efforts. For instance, Department of Homeland Security continued research on EMP and geomagnetic disturbances as mandated by Trump's 2019 executive order and by Congress. But critics argue the momentum slowed after 2020. In fact, some observers claim the Biden administration dropped the ball directly on EMP protection. The sentiment is that while studies have been done and the threat is acknowledged in strategy documents, there has not been a major push to fund and install hardware fixes like surge protectors, neutral ground blockers, etc., at least at a national scale. One article quoted a former U.S. Air Force officer saying, "Yet the Biden administration is failing to do something about it regarding EMP preparedness. So a lot of hardening that has happened remains at the conceptual or planning level, or its voluntary measures by utilities rather than mandated national upgrades." Another aspect, while the civilian grid saw modest movement, the U.S. military has taken EMPs seriously for a really long time. Many military systems are hardened against an EMP, at least to some degree. Jets, command centers, strategic communications, these are designed to withstand nuclear environments, including EMP. So the military might ride out an EMP better than our civilian infrastructure, but the military needs a functioning civilian sector to actually sustain the country it's defending. Congressional activity. Congress has introduced bills and held hearings on an EMP threat for years. There was the SHIELD Act, the GRID Act, aiming to empower federal agencies like FERC, the Federal Agency Regulatory Commission, to mandate grid EMP protection standards. These often stalled or they got watered down. Instead, what happened to FERC is FERC instructed the grid operators to develop standards for geomagnetic disturbances as a result of 1989 and the 2003 incidents. So now there are some regulations in place to handle moderate solar storms. For example, requiring certain procedures when solar alerts are high and some retrofits. But again, these are geared to prevent blackouts like 1989, not to handle a monster Carrington-class event or a nuclear EMP scenario. The difference is scale. A truly extreme event could exceed those standards by far. The most recent development, at least in our scenario timeline, is actually today in 2025. Not today specifically like May 1st, but now. As of January 2025, President Donald Trump, in his second term, is back in office and has signaled he wants to pick up where he left off. Indeed, just April, I don't know what the date was in April, but in April, President Trump signed a new executive order aimed at strengthening grid reliability and security even further. While details are still emerging, this April 2025 executive order reportedly focused on accelerating the hardening of critical grid infrastructure. against both cyber and EMP threats, improving coordination for solar storm warnings, and investing in technologies to protect the large transformers that would be most vulnerable from such a storm. It's basically trying to close the gap that critics say were left in the past few years. The administration is also talking about revisiting the suspended bulk power systems to ensure we are not installing untrusted equipment. There's even a rumor of an initiative to explore space-based sensors to detect EMP attacks and improve missile defense to intercept warheads that could produce EMPs. It's clear that, at least at the leadership level, the EMP issue is back on the priority list. Let's summarize the government action. We had recognition and some planning, but full implementation and protective measures still lagging. The federal government's approach has been fragmented. Some progress under one administration, much less focus on another. Now perhaps more focus is coming back again. Meanwhile, the electric utility industry has often resisted costly EMP regulations, arguing that the threat is only theoretically or low probability, and that the mitigation costs could be tens of billions of dollars, are not justified compared to other priorities. However, if the grid went down because of one of these events, I'm going to say they would, well, it's a very, very bad mistake to not spend the money to harden the grid. Not just for high altitude EMPs, which could never happen, but we got missed in 2012. There's a solar maximum every certain amount of years. The risk is real when it comes to solar flares and CMEs. This is a classic security dilemma. Spend a lot now to potentially save civilization later, when later has an unknown chance of occurring on our watch. Many in the industry roll their eyes at the EMP and focus on things like hurricanes, which of course they should be doing also, which they face regularly. But advocates respond, by the time we face an EMP, it's too late. We either harden beforehand or we suffer the grave consequences. Given this reality, man, I gotta say, don't count on the government to save you in the immediate aftermath of an EMP. Really don't count on the government to save you in most incidents. It's just, especially on a large scale event, we are probably going to be on our own. They will be overwhelmed, and despite the efforts, systems remain very, very vulnerable. Some states and localities have started their own initiatives. For instance, some state legislators looked at studying EMP impacts on state grids, and there are grassroots groups educating emergency managers about this. It's good, but again, in a nationwide event, help from authorities could be minimal for a very long time. So this all circles back to personal preparedness. We've outlined how bad it could be and how the cavalry may not arrive in time, but what can we do as individuals, families, and communities to prepare for and survive a potential EMP-induced societal blackout? That's where we turn next to practical preparedness and planning for life after the lights go out. So, how are we going to survive the aftermath if something like this were to happen? Personal preparedness and pace planning. That is how. We're not going to go completely crazy getting into personal preparedness and pace planning tonight. This was really to cover, solar flares and EMPs, but we are going to touch on some brief subjects on it. Up till now, we've painted a pretty apocalyptic picture. It's heavy stuff. I know. I get it. But at the point of this isn't to spark fear. It's definitely not to spark fear for fear's sake. It's to motivate action. As daunting as an EMP scenario is, there are concrete steps you can take today to improve your odds and reduce suffering. If you haven't already, again, check out our new pace planning book, thesurvivalsummit.com, or you can find it on Amazon. Think of preparing for an EMP like preparing for a slow motion disaster, one that strikes instantly but whose aftermath is prolonged. It has similarities to prepping for a massive earthquake or a hurricane, but on steroids with a major nationwide scope. But your basic needs are going to stay the same: shelter, fire, water, food, medical, signaling, land navigation, and communications. Let's break some of those down. We're not going to break them down in every category, but the pace planning methodology for communications and contingency planning, again, PACE stands for primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. When it comes to water is going to be your number one priority in most disasters. Store as much as you can. FEMA is going to recommend like a gallon per person per day for emergencies, for drinking and sanitation. In an EMP event, you should ideally have a minimum of 2 weeks of water stored per person. So that's a lot of water. If you have the space, more than a month if you can. It's not overkill because municipal water systems will be down. In addition to stored water, you have to have a means to collect and purify water as well. This could be as simple as water filters, like backpacking filters or countertop filters, water for purification tablets, or know how to boil or even distill water or make a solar still. There's a lot of ways to collect water. If you have a well on your property, consider having a manual pump attachment for that well or a solar powered pump with solar powers, panels, and batteries stored and protected from an EMP until you actually need them. Put them in a Faraday bag or a Faraday cage, and then you'll be all set if that does happen. Water sources like rivers, pond, and rain catchment can be lifesavers if you can purify them. Remember, without power, fuel, or treatment chemicals, many water sources might end up contaminated. Sewer treatment fails, so filtration is going to be key. Food, you should always aim to have 3 to 6 months of non-perishable food stored for your house. Talking about canned goods, dried goods, rice, beans, pasta, dehydrated, freeze-dried meals. My Patriot Supply is a great company for 25-year shelf life freeze-dried foods. Focus on calories and nutrients, the things you need to store long-term and really keep you going. Think in terms of 2,000 calories per person per day, and also stock up on vitamins and salt because it could be really hard to come by. And you're going to need electrolytes, and you may even need salt for drying out some of your meats to preserve them a little bit longer. You want to learn about home canning, preserving, and just storing what you eat normally in rotation is going to be wise. If you have the ability to grow food or raise small livestock, chickens, rabbits, those are going to be excellent, sustainable sources, but they require advanced preparation and practice, not something you're going to go out and get chickens the day after something crazy happens. So make sure you start looking into, I'm telling you, chickens are awesome. We have, I think, 14 right now, and we're getting more. We're going to have 20. And chicken eggs from fresh chicken eggs are nothing like you're going to find in the grocery store. Even ones they say that are pasture raised and free range. The chickens that you raise yourself, the eggs are so much better. It's really incredible. So medicine and health, that's going to be a big one. If you and your family members have essential medications like insulin, heart meds, you need to talk to your doctor about keeping an emergency supply if possible. If not, contact Jace Medical. You can even contact a company like Duration Health. We've been working with Jace Medical lately. We do have an affiliate link, but I'm not going to post that anywhere. I think it's in a link in our bio if you really want to check it out. But Jace Medical, you can get not just emergency antibiotics, but you can get emergency kind of almost anything, really. You're not going to get pain meds or anything like that. So don't think of it like that. But chronic conditions, you're going to be able to get an emergency off-grid supply of medications for chronic conditions through a company like Jace Medical. Of course, you have to go through their doctors. You have to get approved. But it's actually a very simple process. So you should definitely check them out. Rotation is needed since a lot of meds will expire, although there have been studies that most medications can last for many, many years beyond expiration. But consult your doctor, consult a professional. I'm not giving you advice to do that because there are at least a couple of them that can become toxic if they sit for too long, but it's not very many. I think the military even did a study that said most medications could even last 10 years past expiration. But you need to do your own research. This is not medical advice. Also stuck up on general emergency supplies, first aid kit, over-the-counter meds like pain relievers, antidiarrheal, hygiene, soap, toothpaste, feminine products. Poor sanitation can lead to disease outbreaks post-disaster. So even store bleach or pool shock to make disinfectant, trash bags, know how to safely handle waste if your plumbing is a problem. Power and lighting. While you likely can't power your whole house off grid easy, even with the best of solar systems, depending on what you have, of course, you can aim to have some independent power for crucial devices. Solar chargers and power banks are fantastic. They're not immune to EMPs, so long wires could still pick up pulses, but the small portable panels or like the EcoFlow units and some of the solar panels, you can put them in protective Faraday cages or Faraday bags. I don't believe a high altitude EMP is really going to affect a solar panel, but it could affect the wiring to the solar panel, but it will affect your solar generator. So you need to make sure those devices are protected. You want to keep flashlights. You want to make sure you keep plenty of lights, plenty of batteries. There's just a lot of like candles, oil lamps. There's a lot of things, but just be careful. Be mindful of the risk of fire, of course. You want to be very, very careful. Now, heating and cooling, depending on your climate, lack of heating in the winter or summer can be life-threatening. If you live in a cold region, you need a backup heating plan. It doesn't rely on electricity or natural gas. Wood stoves and fireplaces are great if you have them, and fuel stocked up for them. Propane heaters with proper ventilation can work awesome. Some people have 1,000-gallon tanks. And if you have, especially if you have a home that's not massive and you have a 1,000-gallon propane tank, you can run heat for quite a long time. But you want to have warm clothes, blankets, even a tent that you can kind of set up as a micro warm space, a tent in your house just to kind of trap in the body heat. But again, make sure you're focusing on ventilation, stay hydrated. If you can get battery powered fans when it's really hot weather, even with a solar charger, it could give you a little bit of relief when you're in extreme heat. You definitely do not want to get heat stroke. I had a little bit of heat stroke once. I thought I was going to have to go to the emergency room. It's a long story, but it's not good. It's very terrible. First few days of an EMP, most likely people are going to be confused and stunned. But as those days turn into weeks with no help, crime is going to go crazy. So you need to think about security. When the lights go out, human nature means a lot of people are going to turn desperate and a lot of people are going to turn opportunistic. So you need to consider home and personal security. That means pew-pews, ammo, self-defense, sturdy locks, reinforcing the entry points of your home. Look into the 3M security glass, which makes it much, much more difficult for someone to break through the glass in your home. But you can break out from the inside easier in case of fire. But somebody getting in, it could take them 10 minutes with a hammer to get through the glass, giving you enough time to get ready to defend yourself if they've gotten through all your other layers of security and now they're breaching the home. So transportation, as discussed, some vehicles might work, some might not. If you have like a pre-80 classic car or a diesel with a mechanical fuel pump, you're probably going to be perfectly fine. Kind of use that as a backup EMP-proof vehicle. The problem is all those older vehicles now, the cost is crazy. Cars and trucks you could, like older ones that you could get for a couple $1,000s, they're going for $10,000, $15,000 now. So it is not as easy as it used to be just to kind of pick up an old beater that you don't have to worry about an EMP with. So a lot of people will store certain electronic parts, like replacement ignition module, starter relay, engine control units, things like that in Faraday bags. That way, if your car electronics do get fried and you don't have like a super new car with hundreds of microprocessors, that you can keep some tools and learn how to switch some of these components out to get your vehicle back up and running. You can also check with Faraday Defense. They have a lot of great products that can help EMP-proof your vehicle, or at least improve the chances, if not fully working against an EMP, depending on, there's so many variables with EMPs, especially the high altitude EMP with the E1. EMP Shield is another company that some people like. I don't really know much about them, but I hear they have a lot of testing for their devices. And hey, bicycles. Bikes are golden in a scenario with no fuel and impassable roads filled with stalled cars. So a bike's going to let you move faster than walking. You don't need fuel. Consider having bikes for your family, carts for hauling supplies, things like that. Community and skills. This is overlooked a lot, but it's really, really important. No one can be an island in a long-term societal collapse. You have to be able to connect with neighbors and local friends. You really should be discussing emergency plans. Maybe not everybody will take you seriously pre-disaster, and people will probably roll their eyes at you, but you need to find the people who understand or at least have useful skills. After an EMP, people are going to naturally band together in neighborhoods for help and security. It's better to have some relationships and plans before that would ever happen. You may not like your neighbors, but at least your family and your friends, just come up with a plan. Start thinking about pace planning now before something happens. And man, if you have people that are into first aid, they have medical skills, gardening, mechanics, hunting, fishing, foraging, carpentry, self-defense, welding, these are all going to be, and especially tactical training, these are going to be critically important skills that you can cross-train your group and your community so you can all teach each other a little bit of what everyone else knows. Every skill can be a contribution too. If you just know someone who knows how to purify water, fix small engines, or treat a wound, you can become pretty valuable post-disaster. You know, start making printed copies of crucial information like medical treatment guides, edible plant guides. You don't want to. You're not going to remember everything, and if there's skills that you want to learn or you want to teach, you're going to want to keep some references. And again, I like to keep a spare cell phone in a Faraday bag with an EMP thumb drive that has thousands of survival manuals. And I also keep a spare iPad because it's much easier to read on the iPad. You just need the connector that goes with it to be able to look at all that stuff. And as long as you keep a solar powered power bank that you can recharge all your devices with, keep all that in the same Faraday bag, and you really should be all set. But of course, USB thumb drives fail, so you want to make multiple copies. So if one fails, you don't lose your thousands of manuals. It's better than trying to carry hundreds and hundreds of books around and things like that. I do want to talk briefly, specifically about PACE, Primary, Alternate, Contingency, and Emergency. A planning methodology particularly useful in communications, but applicable to all areas of preparedness. It's about having backup layered plans. If plan A fails, you have plan B. Plan B fails, you have plan C. Plan C fails, everything fails, you still can resort to plan D, which is your emergency plan. Now, you're also going to have many different plans, and depending on how much you travel, where you work, how far you are from work, if you're on vacation, there's a lot of variables to PACE planning for sure. But your core needs are not going to change very much. You're always going to need to be looking at the 9 pillars of preparedness: shelter, fire, water, food, signaling, land nav, communications, personal security, and my goodness, I missed one. It's been a long night. This is a pre-recorded stream, and the first 2 streams that I did, one was 20 something minutes, the other one was maybe 15 minutes, but the video was going in and out and the sound was going in and out. So I have had to pre-record this whole thing, and I basically am going through this for a third time. So I'm a little bit frazzled over that. I really wanted to do this live, and I wanted to do it with everybody who usually watches, but if you're watching this, that means it's already posted and you can watch it whenever you want. You don't have to watch it live. So when it comes to communications, I want to talk about communications when it comes to PACE planning, because especially after something like a high altitude EMP or a massive solar flare that could take down the grid, you're going to want multiple ways to get information out, not just to reach family and loved ones, but your allies, people that you've planned with. So let's apply PACE to communications. So primary is the P in PACE. This is your primary means of communication under normal conditions. So that usually means your cell phone or internet-based messaging. In an EMP scenario, assume this fails pretty much immediately because the cell networks will most likely be down. Some people's primary in a disaster might be FRS, GMRS, two-way radios for local communication with family around the neighborhood. Another alternate could be, walkie-talkies kept in Faraday bags or ham radios. It really depends on your skill level. And if you want to get into ham amateur radio, I think, and I'm getting into it now as well, and GMRS with repeaters, which you need a registration with the FCC, but you don't need a license, but you do need a license for ham radio, depending on, there's some variables with it. And for a lot of prepared folks, ham radio is going to be where it's at. And man, if you have your amateur radio license, and again, I highly recommend it, you can check out hamradioprep.com. They have some prep courses for those tests. You can coordinate with an entire network of ham operators. Ham operators, at least those who prepared their gear against an EMP, if that's what happens, could be the kings of communication. They could be passing around news and even relaying messages. So your alternate plan could be ham radios, but don't just buy a ham radio and never learn how to use it. They're not going to be just, hey, let me take it out of the box and turn it on like a walkie-talkie and use it. It's not going to work that simple. It's going to be Very, very difficult. Your contingency plan, man, could be physical runners, could be messengers, could be rendezvous points. Like, hey, if we're all separated and all the comms are dead, everyone head to Uncle Joe's farm 50 miles away by whatever means possible within whatever, 1 to 3 days. Come up with a specific timeline. Those are the types of contingency plans that you want to have some pre-written instructions. And if you check out Mad Gear Company on Instagram, and I think it's on Facebook as well, they have an amazing contingency planner. And actually, they have an app now where you can input all your contingency planning information in an app, and you can even share it with other people. And I think it pairs really nicely with the pace planning book. So check out Mad Gear for sure. Their pace planning contingency planners are pretty awesome. And hey, if you're emergency when it comes to communications, everything else is shot. You could be going to primitive, like visual signals, hand signals, graffiti markings, putting symbols, letting people know you're okay, letting people know we're listening to a certain radio station at a certain time. That's really worst case scenario. And if you don't have a good pace plan, you don't have a lot of good communication set up, and you're not protecting them, and you don't have training on them, you're probably not going to be communicating very well. So you really need to be careful when it comes to that. And, special note on information in a disaster like this, good intel is going to be critical. You're going to want to know how widespread the event is, what the governments are saying, specifically your government, if there might be relief zones. Radio could be the best source when internet and TV are down. Simply a battery-powered or hand-cranked NOAA weather radio can receive AM and FM and shortwave and could catch some emergency broadcast, assuming the stations manage to get back on air or have generators and their critical infrastructure at those stations wasn't destroyed. The government does have some systems for emergency broadcasting that they'll try to use for sure, so be sure to have a radio and spare batteries in your Faraday kit. Shortwave radios can even pick up international broadcasts. So you might literally get news from overseas about what's happening in the United States or whatever country you happen to be in if your domestic communications have failed. During the Cold War, there was actually a plan for radio stations to come back after a nuclear EMP to provide info. So I suspect some EMP-hardened transmitters exist at key locations. Ham radio operators will also transmit situational reports. So if you have a shortwave radio, you can listen to ham frequencies. Even if you don't transmit on those, you can still listen to them. But you need to learn about these devices because they're not just simply pick them up, boom, start talking. They can be complicated. So you really need to learn all about these systems. And again, keep more gas. Keep your gas tank more than half full at all times if possible. If you have a truck, try to keep some spare gas cans. Even keep a siphon kit. So if you have to siphon gas from other abandoned vehicles or abandoned pump stations or whatever it might be, this is something that you're going to want to think about. I want to close now by shifting from the practical back to the big picture with a little bit of optimism. As dark as this scenario was, it's not hopeless. Humans survived for thousands of years before electricity. It would be pretty bad to go back so abruptly, but those who are prepared and adaptable, you can make it. And eventually you can rebuild. Society would reform, most likely in a much different way, but life finds a way. Unless, of course, it's Armageddon, that you are not going to stop that. There's nothing you can do about it. And Jesus will be coming back. And that's a good thing. But until he comes back, it's craziness. And it's not going to be a good thing. So hopefully with the renewed government attention and public pressure, we're going to see some changes. And we're going to seriously think about hardening our grid and our critical infrastructure. Because, man, if we don't, and there's another massive solar flare, or some crazy nation decides to detonate a high-altitude nuclear device 250 plus miles into the atmosphere, it could be devastating to this country and to the world, honestly. So we've journeyed through a pretty intense landscape tonight, from high-altitude detonations of nukes to the fury of the sun's solar storms, from historical close calls to the fragile present, from the halls of government to the pantry and tool shed at your own house. It's a lot to take in, and if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, take a deep breath. The goal here is not to make anyone feel helpless, but empowered with knowledge and motivate you to prepare. I would definitely check out the book 1 Second After. by William Forstchin. I'm pretty sure that's how you say it, William Forstchin. It's 1 second after. It's the novel that was talked about in one of the congressional hearings when they asked, is that 90% fact from 1 second after? Is that really possible? And one of the EMP commissioners said, yes, we believe that's pretty accurate, or whatever the quote was that I mentioned earlier. I had it on my notes, but I don't have it in front of me anymore. So just, man, knowledge is power. Training, you can have tons of gear, but if you don't have training and you don't spend time learning, some of that gear may not help you. So get out there, start practicing, start putting together a good comprehensive pace plan. And hey, we'll have another live stream next week, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I still have to figure out exactly what happened during the 2 live stream attempts, because the internet was fine. The camera seemed to be working. I don't know exactly. It could have been Streamlabs. I'm not sure, because I'm using the camera now on a different software to record this pre-recorded live stream. Really more of a podcast now, I guess. But hopefully we'll see you guys next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern on Facebook, X, Twitch, and TikTok. And YouTube, if I didn't say YouTube. All right. You guys have a good night, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.